Welcome to Building Better Businesses, an ABA podcast. Learn firsthand from business owners who've built successful ABA businesses. Utilize proven techniques and strategies to help your practice thrive. This is Building Better Businesses, an ABA podcast with Jonathan Mueller.
My name's Jonathan Mueller. I'm the host of Building Better Businesses in ABA podcast, and I'm pumped to have John and Jill Jacobson with me today. Jill has over 35 years of healthcare experience, 20 of those in executive roles of large national organizations. Jill's worked in the ABA field for almost 10 years as president, CEO, as chief compliance and growth officer, and in various consulting roles. And John Jacobson took a path less traveled to the world of talent acquisition and human resources in ABA. He has a bachelor's in chemistry and a master's in human resource management, and he split his career between manufacturing and healthcare. And there are many more commonalities, listeners, than you might think. We're going to get to those in a little bit. John's been involved with ABA since 2014. And the two of them, John and Jill, are the partners and founders of J2Jacobson Consulting. John and Jill, welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Jonathan. Happy to be here.
I'm so happy to have you. And Jill, I want to start with you. We met, I think it was almost 3, maybe 4 years ago, like literally before the world shut down, pre-COVID, at a conference in LA. And gosh, I just feel like I hit it off with you from the get-go and how we think about our field and the world and looking at analogs in other healthcare verticals. But I want to ask, so you've worked as a chief compliance and growth officer at one of the biggest national ABA providers. What'd you learn from that experience?
I'm going to say this several times today. How long do you have? I think just to back up a little bit, I think first and foremost in my national experiences in healthcare period in the last 20 years or so, I think what it's really done is secure my commitment to what I feel is probably the most important or sacred value to me, and that's integrity. It doesn't matter what your role is in any organization, professional, clinical, operational, paraprofessional, it doesn't matter. Without integrity, without accountability to your own actions, your behaviors, you're going to struggle, right? You're going to second guess yourself, not really sure where that moral compass is going to be or where it's going to lead. But living by that mantra of just do the right has provided me just that sense of peace, whether it's personally or professionally in my career. I will say it doesn't mean that you're always rewarded for that or commended for that. That can get a little sticky, but surrounding yourself with people that exemplify true integrity creates a really good, positive ecosystem, right? Just whether it's in your personal life or whether it's in your professional life. I think my most recent experience as chief growth officer and compliance officer just solidified for me, just do the right thing. I think secondly to that, and more specific just to the world of ABA, it's been reinforced for me and had to relearn this, I think, in my hospice career, which was very long, and Disney Institute helped me with this, that the client and the family unit experience is just as equally important as the team member experience. And I think especially as we've been going through the Great Resignation, quiet quitting, those types of things, that it's really important. And so that was a little bit renewed for me over these last couple of years. I think that the size of the provider, the national footprint, those kinds of things, my greatest takeaway there is that it's all about relationship. If you want that culture of compliance, that culture of that support strategically growing the business, you have to have relationships, not just at the executive level, but throughout the organization. And that helps you to build those relationships with funders as well. Educating the team about scrutiny and those kinds of things that you see rising in the world of compliance and regulatory. It just helps people to see the importance of those relationships within an organization. It's the people, it's the process, it's passion makes this work.
It's almost like organizations have to build this compliance culture into their DNA, right? I've always thought that's the right way to think about it, right? It's not because you've got some poster on the wall. It's not because you've just got a link at the bottom of your email that says report a compliance concern. There's this entire culture around compliance that you have to set expectations for, including your performance management systems, communicate frequently around. Does that seem accurate?
It is. And it's interesting. What I brought to the world of ABA was what we call QAPI in the rest of healthcare, quality assessment, performance improvement. And it's not something that's mandated, so to speak, in the world of ABA because we don't really have a regulatory body. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this today. We have the BACB, but that's just for a provider, right? It doesn't really go beyond that. I'm a nurse. I'm not a BCBA. So you're not going to take any action against me as an owner or an operator or a chief compliance officer. So you're right. It's not a poster on the wall. It's not this plan that I put in a binder somewhere or have online in our intranet. It's about building that culture and knowing that if I come forward and I disclose something, or I think that maybe something doesn't feel right, and I talk with my supervisor, then I'm not going to be penalized for that. And we talk about ethics so much in this industry, more than any other place I've ever been in healthcare. And it's not that physicians don't have ethics. It's not that everybody else doesn't have ethics in the world of healthcare. But John will call it situational ethics. We talk about it a lot, but I don't think that we have it quite figured out everywhere still in the world of ABA about how to build that culture. And you're absolutely right. It comes down to that relationship.
Well, it's one of the things that I've loved about getting to know you. You've had this long and storied career in healthcare. As you point out, you're a nurse. You come from the hospice field, which, by the way, I power to you. It is extraordinary to me how nurses and everyone involved with someone who's going through the dying process. That's powerful. But you mentioned QAPI, and I'm going to drop a link in the show notes because this is an example of analogs we can look to in other parts of healthcare that will at some point apply to ABA because our field, though our science is old, our field is still in its infancy. And I think that's a really good sort of compliance lens for thinking about building it into your organizational DNA. So, John, I want to turn to you. And by the way, John, you and I just got to meet this past summer. We had a conversation. And you know, what my first thought was, I was like, where has Jill been hiding you all this time? Are you kidding me? It was like this phenomenal conversation. And I keep thinking, if I were to have to ask who is my favorite Jacobson, that's not fair because it's like asking who's your favorite kid. You can't say that. But well, both my favorite Jacobsons.
No, it's really okay. Of everybody who we've both worked with and in healthcare, they always say, John's the nice one. Right? So
there was a couple interesting stats that y'all shared, and it's in a presentation on your website that I'll drop a link to in the show notes. I think it was from the Gallup organization that 1 in 10 people have the components to be a successful manager. And then the second was that managers account for 75% of the variability in organizational performance. So this just freaking blew my mind. Not as surprising, but just blew my mind. Like, what insights did you glean from that ABA providers can take on to improve it?
Yeah, it certainly is a mind-blowing thing, but very real. And like you said, it's not hard to then say, wow, that does make a lot of sense. And we just don't have that training. One of the main insights to me is it comes from, we have rightly so focused on leadership qualities more so than management skills when we look to hire employees or we look to promote employees. Leadership has taken over in the last number of years. And again, rightly so. We want people that can lead. It's absolutely critical. But we can't overlook these other things. We as people don't come with these management skills. Sometimes we can't manage ourselves, let alone manage other people. So to think that just because I want to put a manager title on you, you have those skills is a wrong way to think. And then we exacerbate that as employers because we're not good at hiring people. So we have a management position open and we hire somebody, but we don't know what to look for. We don't know how to hire. So then we make it even a little bit worse in that, or we don't make it a whole lot better. I think that the insight is that managers and management is taken for granted. It's that it needs to be done, but everybody can just do that. I think when I taught for that 1 year, somebody said, you can just muddle through. There's a lot of muddling going on out there, and we need to do more to do that. But we expect these people are ready to roll. When we hire a new BCBA that just showed up on LinkedIn with that photo with their certificate, it's the best thing in the world that they've reached that achievement. But for us to think that they are ready to do all of the things that we then expect of them is a little bit short-sighted. And I think the other thing that has taken place over time is that there has been the reduction in the willingness to train by organizations. And so much of that comes in margin and all, not just in ABA, but in everything. And so one of the first things to go always is that on-the-job training. And we think, we hired you you have these characteristics and you have this certification, you have these different things, you can do the job. Yes, but you don't have all of the skills that are going to go into that. And ABA is no different than other things, but maybe it's even more complex because to me, when I look at different things, if you hire a nurse first into nursing, usually they're coming into a position that is a little bit lower down on the scale than a clinical director or a manager of a unit or something, but they are doing the tasks using the skills that they were trained for. In ABA, you come in as a BCBA and you are expected to manage right away. You're not just doing the things that they taught you, but you have case management. You have family management. You've got the tech management, all of those things. And then you throw on top of that, there's just all kinds of different facets there. There's logistics, there's productivity, there's communication, there's the financial part, there's technology, performance management, even labor relations, because nobody can work without having labor relation issues about whether it's I was late because I had so-and-so problem or somebody got in my way or whatever. Those things come up every single day, multiple times. And so we don't do a good job with that. And so I think in that, we have to, as individuals, understand that we have to be open to the concept that our education is not finished when we come out. And I think we always talk about this lifelong learning, but this is a little bit different in that these are just skills. Maybe we didn't want to do those skills or to have those skills. Maybe that's what drove us into our profession. I went into math and science because I wasn't so adept. I didn't think at English or some of those kind of things. So you go into the things that you're better at, but that doesn't mean you don't have to use them, whether it's writing or speaking, different kind of communication tools. You have to be able to have those skills. So we have to be open to that. But then as providers, as owners, as operators, we have to be part of that as well. We have to be able to say, we're committed to bringing someone in that has the right characteristics, has those leadership qualities, has the aptitude to take these things on. But we have to be part of that training. We have to give them those skills and we have to somehow fit it in there amidst all the budget items and everything else and thinking about not just lost revenue and things like that, but we have to give them those skills to perform. And I think that's really critical in ABA. We have to focus both on leadership and on management. They're separate, but they're both quite important.
I think this is so critical, especially in our field, because case management, case supervision, and being an effective supervisor to your RVTs is a fairly unique model in healthcare. It exists, right, with physician's assistants and nurse practitioners and others, but it is crucial just to deliver the service that BCBA has to be a good supervisor. I'm curious, John, are there analogs in other parts of healthcare or other organizations or just best practices around this idea you describe of, hey, this is on us. We have to give supervisors those skills to perform. What are some best practices around training for managerial skill sets?
I certainly think there are some. Jill can add to this, but you always talked about preceptors in hospice. And in hospice, when we would hire people into that, again, we were looking for individuals that had experience already in nursing. We weren't going to say, we're going to hire someone that has 1 year or a brand new grad, but we're hiring people that had 5 years or more in specific areas of critical care, emergency ICU type nursing and that. But then even with that, they had very well established preceptor programs so that they worked with someone who was already in that. So I think that's one really good parallel to look at. And that's an industry, Jill, you can probably add to that.
Yeah. And it's funny when I talk about preceptors or mentorship or academies that I've been a part of or led in my past life. And I mentioned that in the world of ABA. Look, there's a lot of good intention, but it has to be a commitment because I can decide that I'm going to hire X amount of BCBAs and I'm not going to give them a caseload. I'm going to spend the first X amount of weeks or a month or whatever it is doing what John is talking about, right? Really preparing them, leading them, building on the skills that they just didn't get in their education and they have no real work experience yet. But what happens? We have turnover. We have pressures to admit because we all want to provide access to services. And what happens is that somebody comes in and instead of a new caseload that you're going to build for them, they're acquiring someone else's caseload because they're no longer going to be with us. The commitment and the dollars, it's not just time, it's also the dollars to putting in true preceptor programs. I'm not talking about somewhere where you say, God, John, I think you do a really good job out in the field. So I'm just going to have you go with this person because you don't know whether or not they're following policy procedures, whether that what they know and what they don't know. And I have a lot of stories about that. The best preceptor program that I built out in hospice took a full year to build it out with a lot of really good expertise around the table with board support behind it for those finances. Can you scale that? I think so. I'm not going to spend a year when I'm a smaller organization with 10 million in revenue, but I probably have greater influence and control over certain individuals that are those PCAs that could fit into that role. It's a commitment.
And clarify for me, a preceptor, is this someone who has domain expertise in something very specific, a nurse that is, or is it someone who also has expertise around supervision and being able to provide feedback and things?
Right. Right. It has to be specific to the industry, right? You said it yourself. We're talking about 90% of our dollars, our revenue, are generated from a paraprofessional who most likely in our industry is in their early 20s. They could be 18 and have a high school diploma. That's
Mhm.
fine. Go through a 40-hour course and take a national test and pass.
Mhm.
And so 90% of our revenue is generated by that person. And if you're home-based services, they're going to be out there on their own in a couple of weeks. And to make sure that you're equipping folks with the right, like you say, supervision and so forth, take someone that you have the confidence that they have that competence to do so. And what I call meaningful supervision, right? So that they're constantly training and education. I can't tell you how many supervisory visits I did in my nursing career on the home health and hospice side. And yet I would always walk away with a page of notes of, hey, let's talk this through to help them be more efficient, effective, do better, whether it was communication skills or technical skills. I've done roundtables around this where I've had really good people who have done a great job and great documentation around supervision. And I say, how did we get here? And it always comes down to, I had a great supervisor when I was an RVT, and those were their takeaways. And so that's great until you have the BCBA who didn't have a great supervisor or only had exposure to one supervisor in all of their thousands of hours.
Yeah, I think it's such a relevant discussion today because, again, supervision, from my understanding, when I hear it in ABA, sometimes becomes so task-like that they're looking at that my requirement is X% of supervision, meaning I check these things that I did. Well, what we need is we need more than supervision. Maybe it needs a different word to describe it because, again, it's not just being there to say, yes, we did these things, but it's to give them feedback, to give them exactly continued development so that they are learning from what they're doing, what they're seeing with the clients and that, not just saying, I met my 5% or my 10% of a payer requires that or whatever, but am I getting something that is more feedback related and is helping me develop and become a better clinician? It's not just checking that I got the right amount of minutes, but am I getting something valuable to make what I do more valuable to the client?
This is critical to me because the idea of differentiating case supervision, which is truly a quality assurance function in our field, versus people supervision and helping to develop them. And it's that latter that I think I hear you describe. And I see the same thing where organizations aren't investing enough in it. You know what the biggest pushback that I hear when I talk to organizations or when I'm on different provider calls? Oh, we're not getting paid by the insurance company to do supervision. Let me ask, are you getting paid to be compliant? No. But are you compliant? Yes, because it's the right freaking thing to do. So
Right.
that is not an excuse in my book for not providing that highest quality supervision. And that's not just like, okay, in the first few weeks or months to do it. That has to be an ongoing process of learning and sometimes failing at certain things and getting great feedback from their supervisor. That's how anyone who's been exposed to great supervisors and has developed those skill sets, that's how they learn.
Yeah. Bundling codes and reimbursement it's an interesting concept and it's where we're at. And probably the greatest example that I had was from a payer, it was Kaiser out in California, who said to a large group of ABA providers who were complaining about not being paid for something. And he said, when the radiologist goes to map somebody out in order to provide those markers for when he or she gives radiation, they don't get paid separately for that either. It's bundled in the code. It's something that is expected because you can't do your job without it, people. And I just thought that was a great example of, yeah, you're not just going to go in there without markers and do radiation. So same thing here, folks. We don't get paid for everything. In healthcare, that's a whole nother podcast and argument. And some payers do better than others, but you still have to do your.
Absolutely. And part of that job and you mentioned this earlier, Jill, but like turnover is something that makes this legitimately hard to do, right? And especially if you're not documenting SOPs and you don't have standardized training programs and all of that, you're losing intellectual capital as people turn over. So, John, I know you've done consulting work with larger ABA providers on what to do about turnover.
It's certainly not a secret today. That's for sure. Everyone knows and feels it every day. And it's gotten worse, not just for ABA, but in everything, as Jill had mentioned before, quiet quitting and the resignation, all these different changes that we've been going through. But what ABA providers, first of all, need to remind themselves of, and most of them do, but sometimes it gets easy to turn away from this. And that is that turnover affects one group more than any other group, and that's the clients and their families. We get so swamped by all the financial concerns over it, everything from loss of revenue, cost of hiring, it goes on and on. But it's those clients that can't make progress if, first of all, they don't have service. And if all of a sudden they get a tech or a BCBA that is different, oftentimes that's a setback. And so that is a huge thing for the families and the clients, but it's also a huge thing for the payers and everyone else in terms of the overall cost of things. So we need to make sure that when we talk about turnover, we keep focused on that. That is still the guiding principle, is what happens when you have turnover, what happens with the outcome. So that's the first thing that they need to keep in mind. And again, I think most people are, but you get so swamped. I got to make payroll. I got to do everything else. I'm really worried about these things. So it's hard. Then I think the other thing is you have to look at turnover, and you have to expect there's always going to be turnover. That happens. And that's good in some ways, because turnover is created by career advancement. Who doesn't want that for their team members, to have career advancement? So if that means there's not something within the organization and somebody leaves for that, that's a great thing. We are selfish if we think that's not a good thing, but it does create hardship, no doubt about that. There are relocations, there are other family commitments that go with that. And there are babies. In ABA, there's a lot of babies, and that is the greatest possible way to have turnover, but it's real. So my point is, we can't always be overly focused on those things that are outside of our control and that are good things to be happening. We've got a plan for it, certainly. But I think we need to focus more on the areas that can be controlled in turnover. And those come down to relationships, the relationships you have with your team, the structural opportunities that you have built into your organization. And you need to have that. That's important. You can't just hire people in and expect they're going to want to do the same job for the next 20 or 30 years and not have different reasons to advance. We all do that. That's why most people own their business, is because they wanted to advance and they wanted to make those decisions. So we have to make sure that those structural opportunities are there. We have to keep in mind the survival aspects. And with inflation that rears its ugly head now more than ever, we have to understand that compensation and benefits things are things that you have to plan for. And so that has to be there. I think the key in some of the studies that we've done is that there has to be a continuous dialogue. You have to have a communication structure that is well distributed. It can't be one way. So many organizations, communication goes downhill, and we have to do work to make it go the other direction. And that means you have to get out there and you have to talk and you have to listen. That's probably more important than anything, is you have to listen. There's not many employees out there that say, I don't want to say anything. I don't want to chime in. I don't want to affect the good of what we're doing at this company. People want to be involved. That's why people go into ABA. They want to help these kids. They want to help these families. So we as providers have to find ways to make that happen. And that means we have to listen. We always talk about recruitment and retention. I think it should be retention and recruitment. We have to talk always about how am I keeping someone? I was telling Jill earlier, I hate to bring in athletic analogies, but I was listening on the radio and someone was asking a coach, what does this new transfer portal in college athletics mean to you? Has it made your job harder? And he said, no, not really, because my attitude has always been, I need to recruit all of my athletes every day, not before they come in, but every day. And we as providers, whether it's an ABA or anything else, we have to recruit our people every day. We have to listen to them. We have to find ways to get it to be an enjoyable atmosphere. It's not always work isn't always fun, but there has to be something to drive some enjoyment there. And then you got to look at the promises we make. Everyone talks about value or values propositions. That's very important in your recruiting, in your marketing, but it has to be more than that. Just like these other things we talked about, it can't just be something on the shelf or a program that we put out. We've got to test those propositions. Are they working? Are we doing what we say? Do we make good on our promise? Because people will hold you to that and they will turn over if you don't.
There's so much wisdom up and down that. What I always encourage providers, start with that structure like you described, John. Have an org chart and make sure everyone knows who their supervisor is, which sounds so basic, but it's extraordinary how it's easy to assume, oh, everyone knows that these people report to me and the others report to so-and-so down the hall. But then things change and then there's temporary stuff. Just have an org chart that everyone can see that labels their supervisor, and then set up the structures of being great about checking in formally at some frequency. Quiet quitting, like one of these things that has come out of the Great Resignation or that is much newer. But I think I was reading the best antidote to that is just a 30-minute weekly conversation between supervisors.
They're so easy, but it's so hard because we get so mired in the other day-to-day things. We forget about the most important part, and that is talking and listening to people.
Listening to people, right? These are like the basic, or it's almost like skills we teach in preschool, but it is so hard to incorporate with everything else that goes on. And I love this idea about supervisors have to be really good two-way conduits of information. So you have to, as a supervisor, create a culture with your RBTs or whomever your set of supervisees are, where they're comfortable coming to you with feedback or compliance concerns, to your earlier point, Joe. Right? That's on you as a supervisor to create that environment, not just expect that it will happen. And then as people do come to you with challenges, make sure you're communicating upward what you're hearing from your team and vice versa, that you're being a great communicator downward. And I think that's an easily forgotten in the midst of how busy we are. It's an easily forgotten thing to do about creating that culture of psychological safety, great communication, farming for dissent, and then being a great two-way communicator.
Absolutely.
So Jill, we see mergers and acquisitions. I mean, throughout healthcare, not just healthcare, all kinds of companies. But one of the things that I felt, and I don't have data on this, but I have felt in my 10 plus year career and having been involved on both sides of being acquired, just the culture integration, even between two values aligned organizations, it just seems so much harder in ABA. Do you have any sense why that?
I think that what prepared me, and I didn't know it, for ABA integration and cultural integration, the toughest acquisition and integration I ever did was a locally based, hospital-based, nonprofit hospice that I was integrating into one of the top 5 largest national for-profit hospices in the country. And I thought that was the toughest thing I had ever done as far as M&A and integration. And it was because I couldn't just go in and use the same playbook. There were really, really high emotions that had to be dealt with. And so what I didn't know at the time was that would prepare me a little bit to be some more flexible, a little bit more fluid for my ABA experience. To your point, integration is absolutely the lifeline to success. Somebody is putting out a whole lot of money to acquire a provider, and it doesn't matter what metrics that you use for M&A to describe those accomplishments, the clinical and sometimes the operational models, there's just more adaptability in people understanding that, yes, I'm going to have to shift a little bit in my thinking and in my processes compared to culture and cultural integration. And I think that there's a couple of things, right? It doesn't take very long in M&A to know, look, somebody might not be a cultural fit, just like they may not be a clinical operational fit. And so why would you do that acquisition? It takes a lot longer through the diligence process. And I have second guessed myself over a lot of times, 3 months and going, was I right? Can we integrate? And what I love about M&A, and not everybody sees this, but I see M&A as taking two of the best in putting those together. And that's not just operational and business foundation and clinical operations and best practices, but also culturally. And so I see that as taking the best of the best and making something even greater. The integration challenges that I've seen in the world at ABA, they have to do with the life cycle of where we're at in ABA, the fragmentation, the maturity of where we're at in this industry. The people that are drawn to ABA, like John was saying, they're very mission focused. They're very passionate about what they do. And that creates sometimes this perception that they're losing control when they are partnering or joining up with another operation. When really, again, we're just asking that we shift maybe that thought process or how we think about culture and operations. So there tends to be this level of resistance, I think that you're referring to. And it's about change, right? It's about the fact that they have poured their heart and soul into this, that they built this brand, that they built operations around it. And the thought that it could be improved upon is not the first thing that's foremost on their minds. I think that, frankly, not everyone approaches M&A in the same way as well. I think that it's not just those who are being acquired who have to shift their thought process as well. Sometimes the acquiree could learn a lot from the provider that they're acquiring and also have to shift a little bit in their playbook and in their operation, and again, take the best of the best and make it even greater. I think that where I had seen some more success and just less resistance, I'll say, is when it's not pure play ABA and they also have maybe some speech and some OT, maybe some PT. They've got some other services that are involved. And those folks, they've already jumped in feet first. They understand how to work together and they lean in, and they know that they can benefit from the other disciplines, the other sectors, and those tend to be a little bit easier to integrate.
That's an interesting insight. It's almost, hey, if you're building out a more multidisciplinary service model, which by the way, I think is the future of ABA, then some of those complementary skill sets and cross learning can be important. But it's so true. Like this idea of just change is hard. And as leaders, I think it's important for us to remember that if we're, whether it's going through an acquisition or whatever we're experiencing change wise, our teams, our supervisees are experiencing that at an exponential level. And that can be really easy to forget if we're only concentrating on, oh, how am I going to manage through this change?
Right. And Jill, you always talk about too, it's not the change always that's pain, it's the transition. And so for all of us, it's that moment of crossover. And so many times I think there's hurt feelings, some for good reasons, some for not, because again, we're not always transparent. It doesn't mean you did something wrong if you've been acquired or you're acquiring somebody and you're going to adopt some of their practices. That means you're coming together. And again, we're getting stronger as a unit
As an
rather than
industry.
individuals. And so as the industry as well. But it is tricky. That transition and that change
Yeah.
is hard.
A couple decades ago, and I love this story, United acquired Continental. So United Airlines acquired Continental, which had a lot of operations throughout Texas and the Southeast. And part of the challenge was, how do we integrate these cultures and how do we make sure that Continental teams, employees, felt like they had ownership? Because everything became United's processes and
Yeah.
United routes and United, like virtually everything was United uniforms. And the one thing that they kept for Continental that you can see to this day is they kept the logo on the back of the plane. And they changed the colors a little bit to be United's colors, but with the idea, hey, maybe like teams will. Then it's like they still have ownership. Oh my gosh. I was just like, I get the intention behind that. How do we
Yeah.
keep that spirit alive of pride around our brand and what we've built and what we've done? but just throwing it on the back of a rudder. I don't know. John, you spent some of your early career in manufacturing, and you pointed out to me before, like healthcare and manufacturing, though they might seem like two disciplines a world apart, each is rooted in process and people, and the analysis, therefore, of the interaction between those two. And as an example, productivity is something really important in healthcare services, and certainly in ABA, it's really important in manufacturing. And you would design this Finance 101 training you did with your frontline manager. What pain points did you experience that indicated the importance of this Finance 101 training? What was the impact, and how can that apply to the ABA field?
I think it comes down to what we've been talking about before is transparency again. It's giving people the information that they need to be able to do their jobs and to impact the whole, which is, again, is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get everyone to function together as a team so that we're looking at the output of the whole group rather than the individuals. It wasn't to bring it to the frontline managers. It was to bring Finance 101 to everyone, to all the employees. So every single employee that entered in their initial orientation, they received a day's worth of Finance 101 in window hardware in this instance. And so the thought was, if you want ownership of the product and the process and that, you have to give people the tools to do that. And at home, we say, if you've got your checkbook and if it doesn't have any money in it, you can't write a check. With the same kind of concept, we want people to understand how what they do impacts the overall. And so in manufacturing, it's a little bit different. I'll get to AVA here in a second, but in manufacturing, so many times it's repetitive processes. People are assigned one spot. Maybe they're standing on a line, they're doing the same thing over and over again. So they may be handling the same looking parts or the same boxes or whatever. And it's easy to forget and to discount the value of the pieces that you have in your hands and the effect of what you do, whether you decide to take a break and your process stops, or whether you allow parts to go through that aren't good and they get caught later. In manufacturing, the other thing is that each process is dependent on the one before that. All these downstream processes are dependent on you, and most of the processes run continuously. It's not like you do one batch necessarily, but lines are running continuously. So if an individual on a manufacturing line doesn't do their job, it's going to affect somebody down the line. And the inventory is all just in time because you're trying to keep costs down in that. So it becomes something that you have to get people these tools to understand how they fit into the whole process. And so by teaching them that maybe this part is only 3 cents, but you handle 10,000 of them in a day, that's a lot if you make a mistake or something that could affect all of them. And then you affect everything down the line too. If the next group doesn't have parts, they can't do their work. So in ABA, it's also, you're going to have this transparency and you've got to add some of these trainings. So if ABA is able to give some of these financial understanding and some of these different tools to their team members, being transparent, it helps them to understand their role and their impact that they have all the way through. And it's important. Jill talked about it before, 90% of the revenue is coming from that one position for the most part, but there's really just two positions, BCBA and the techs, that are driving revenue. There's a lot of other people in the organization that have to be there, whether it's HR or it's billing or you can name all kinds of them. There's more indirect people than direct. Well, you have to understand how those people are paid. They're not paid by making visits and being paid for it. They're being paid out of that same reimbursement that you're getting from the payer. And I don't think people always understand that. When they get that logic and they understand it, it helps them piece together a little bit more about how things function. I've heard comments where people say, I know we're getting $75 from a payer. Why am I only getting 30 of that or whatever? I should be paid more. Perhaps you should, but you need to also understand all of the other elements. So I think that there's a great opportunity for ABA to add additional training. It's the same thing as I talked about before, the management skills, but we need to give some Finance 101 to all team members to be able to appreciate how those things work. We always talk about consumers. An educated consumer is a better consumer. Same kind of thing as a professional. A more educated, skilled professional is likely going to be a better one and produce better for the team and to have a better impact.
What an extraordinary takeaway. That is Finance 101. Teach that to your frontline RBTs. and to everyone throughout the organization. That's really powerful. And you know what? I've yet to come across someone in my entire career whom, when you invest time to explain the why and to train them, as long as you're doing it for genuine reasons, I've yet to come across someone who's resentful of that. This is always a powerful thing to do. And yet that doesn't happen.
Does that then help that RBT understand that, for example, processes, operations are disrupted during hurricane season? And so does that help somebody understand that we had to shut down on Wednesday, but hey, parents would like to bring their kids in on Saturday? And the RBT saying, you know, I'm not working Saturday. But if you understood the whole financial component and framework of it, maybe you would be more willing to. You want to help the parent and the child out, most importantly, but you got to keep your doors open.
Absolutely. All right. Before we dive into hot take questions, where can people find you online?
They can find us at J2Jacobson Consulting.com. As you said before, we've got some content on there that I think people would find interesting. We posted a presentation for a National Management Training Week, again, talking about these things, the importance of management training. So again, www.J2Jacobson Consulting.com.
Perfect. I'll drop a link to that in the show notes, as well as links to both your LinkedIn profiles, because you all post really important and insightful info. So are you ready for the hot take questions? For each of these, Jill, it'll first be to you and then to you, John, on each question. Kick us off. You're on your deathbed. Jill, what's the one thing you want to be remembered for?
It would be my family. It would be the fact that I hope and believe that I raised two strong, resilient, thoughtful young women.
Awesome. How about you, John?
I think it would be that I was kind, not just in what I said, but in what I did.
See the difference?
I do, but both of those can exist and both are wonderful. Jill, what's your most important self-care practice?
Daily exercise that we end ocean waves.
And mine's exactly the same. Being outside and getting that exercise, and it helps me remind me to be patient. Watching the ocean, seeing that is a good way to calm.
I need that as well. Isn't there something about seeing this like inexorable surge of ocean and like what's happening with gravity and tides and the waves that just makes you feel small and like puts you at peace?
Yeah,
It does. Yeah, it does.
Yep.
Jill, what's your favorite song?
I feel at my age, I should be able to choose one from every decade that I've been alive, but not true. A long time ago when I was dating John, I introduced him to Al Jarreau. So I'm going to go with We're in This Together.
Oh, how about you, John?
Hard to argue with, no doubt. It's hard. There's so many songs out there that mean something to me. Go with one that's more recent, Jason Mraz, Have It All. And it's a great song to me. You can't argue with the lyrics. May you know the meaning of the word happiness. May you always lead from the beating of your chest. Those are the things. I like the story in the song, and it's a good one to be reminded.
I'll add to that lyric, may you be as exciting as a slap bracelet. So that is that song, Have It All, is my daughter's, at least for the last 6 months, #1 most requested song. So we listen to it. And it's just smart in addition to it catchy and cool.
I love it.
Jill, if you give your 18-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be?
So that one's really easy because I'm going to say the same thing that my mother said to me when I was 18. And she said to me, you will never know as much as you think you know right now. And she was right.
Wow. How about you, John?
That don't be afraid to fail. I think that's the thing we got taught. You're always going to succeed. Failure brings more than anything else. And that you don't have to make a career choice at 18. It's okay.
It's okay to work for your career in manufacturing as a chemist and then move on to HR.
And still be looking to figure it out. That's all right.
Absolutely. Jill, you can only wear one style of footwear. What is it?
That's easy. Running shoes.
John?
I'm going to the beach, flip-flops.
Perfect compliments. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. This conversation has been extraordinary. I appreciate you both and what you're doing for our field.
Appreciate you, Jonathan, and all of the commentary and questions and the opportunity for people to express themselves that you're raising in this field. It's making a difference. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the things you had talked about before is what can people do different? What can they start doing? And it's that. And I think you're leading by example. It's asking those questions. It's engaging people in the dialogue, not to be afraid of those things. So stand on the shoulders of people in the past, but be creative and figure out new ways to face the opportunities that are here today and in the future.
I love it. Thank you both.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jonathan.
Appreciate you.
Thanks for listening to Building Better Businesses in ABA podcast. Stay tuned for our next exciting episode. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. We value your feedback. Don't forget to follow us on social media at elementrcm.ai.